Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to day two, session two of the PAFI annual forum. And the one theme that actually resonated across panels yesterday was how geopolitics and hostilities between countries could upend India's promising growth story. This was a recurring sort of a theme that emerged through the day. And, on a cursory glance of the global map, very clearly shows the escalations and tensions and the simmering tensions that exist, across various countries, right? From a friction standpoint. So you have the U.S. China trade wars that have been on since 2018, causing tremendous amount of hardships to consumers by way of, expensive goods and businesses, of course. You have the Ukraine-Russia flashpoint underway, which again has triggered crisis on the energy front, on exports of wheat. Russia is a huge exporter of these products. In the Middle East, you have the Israel, Palestine issue. You have Iran, which consistently has sort of, had problems with its neighbors. You have Yemen and Syria, which are constantly at loggerheads. And of course, the Brexit negotiations where the UK as one bloc is, has issues with the other EU bloc. China and Taiwan, big issues that could erupt at any point. And let's not forget, Taiwan is a primary producer of, manufacturer of microprocessors, right? And just around the corner, you have the Korean Peninsula. You have, a powerful gentleman with a nuclear trigger. And you never know when he's going to sort of get adventurous. And both South Korea and Taiwan are major microprocessor manufacturers, and at the end of the day, every single product has these magical pieces of hardware embedded in them. And of course, India, China, Pakistan, so it continues. And clearly, the interconnected nature of the modern world and economies implicates that regional and global conflicts can adversely impact trade, investment, and overall stability, and India is no exception. For a nation that is hoping for sustained, robust growth, disruptions can impede progress and challenge the resilience of our economic policies. In this backdrop, the role of multilateral treaties and collaborative agreements and groupings like the G20 become crucial and extremely relevant. These platforms provide a framework for diplomatic dialogue and conflict resolution. These platforms ensure that nations can address their grievances through negotiations rather than resorting to economic sanctions or other destabilizing measures. However, in a world where unilateralism seems to be the norm, it seems to take precedence over collective action, the efficacy of multilateralism faces challenges. With that context, the question is protectionism the way forward? What role do governments have in this scenario? What about industry? They need to be accountable too at some point. And also, not to forget, as the gentleman pointed out this morning, what about consumers? They have a valid say on some of these issues. And let's not forget about innovation. To discuss and debate all of these issues, we have an illustrious panel this morning. And I'd like to welcome Nayanima Basu, Editor, Foreign Affairs, Strategy and National Security, ABP Live. We have Pranab Dahal Samanta, Executive Editor of the Economic Times. We have T.S. Vishwanath, Director General, past President and founding member, PAFI, and Principal Advisor, ASL Legal. And Varghese K. George, Resident Editor, Delhi, the Hindu, a newspaper where I worked for about 6.5 years, my first job. So please keep your questions easy for Varghese. And of course, our very own Deep Pal, Director Pafi, who's going to moderate this session. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for starting us off. A great note, Chetan. All questions will be easy. All we want to do over the next 50 minutes or so is solve the world's geoeconomic and geopolitical problems. So that with this panel, I don't think that'll be so much of a problem. So to basically take off from where Chetan left off, right? One of the major things that we have seen in the last few years is people who believe that geoeconomics and geopolitics were two separate things. They're not so separate anymore, right? They've come together. We saw this as recently as when the Ukraine-Russia conflict started. We saw the direct impact that had on crude, and then we saw the direct impact that had on India's relations with various countries who had advice for India on how India should get its crude, where it should get it from, at what price it should get it from, and so on and so forth, right? And this is something that we have seen happen constantly since then, and most recently, as recently as last month, or this month, when we saw hostilities break out in the Middle East. And I'm sure all of us have read many analysis pieces that have talked about what happens if this spreads beyond Israel-Palestine, as the various oil-producing nations and other hotspots in the region, if they get involved, what does that mean for India? Where does it take it? So what we'll try to do is basically look at these various issues, geopolitical as well as geoeconomic, and try to understand if there are trend lines emerging. Is it possible or is it likely that global security is reducing to the extent where there can be further hotspots for countries, for corporations that are present in large parts of the globe? Are there ways in which they can, well, not crystal ball gaze, but at least foresee what should they be looking for to understand the direction in which the global security situation is moving, and what can they do about it? Are there significant strategies that can be put in place to navigate this increasingly fraught terrain? I'm going to start with inviting on my panelists for a couple of minutes for their initial thoughts, and then we will focus on themes as well as specific global areas. The order in which I will invite them: Pranav, I'll come to you first. Varghese, after that to you. Vish, then to you, and Nanima, after that to you, and then we'll take it from there. So, Pranav, over to you.
So yeah, to begin with, economics is actually holding things together. But geopolitics is kind of fraying things. I have to understand, and just to put things in context before to roll out the discussion, I just want to put 3 points on the table to just figure out what has happened. Go back a little bit in time. I think this is a period somewhere in the 2010s when this great power withdrawal started happening. U.S. started looking inward, and they began to withdraw themselves from East Asia, from the Middle East, and also we know about the withdrawal plans which happened in Afghanistan. All of that played out in different ways. When the first withdrawal happened in East Asia, there were a lot of red flags, but US moved out and China walked in. That's when we saw the whole push on South China Sea, territorial integrity is being questioned, etc., etc. China started gaining strategic preeminence while the Americans looked the other way. Similarly, in the Middle East, the Americans pulled out, wanted regional dynamics to play out, and were looking at some kind of a regional solution. And suddenly, they find themselves in this current situation as of now, where there's a big hole in the Abraham Accords. They again started to withdraw from Europe, and there was this whole argument during the Trump presidency that Europe should manage its own affairs, pay for its own security. And right walked in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russia wanted to gain that strategic place. So there was a vacuum which started getting created after the Americans started withdrawing from many of these regions for their own political reasons. And now have had to come back. So the re-entry has been with an Indo-Pacific strategy in East Asia, trying to backstop the Ukrainians in the war against Russia. And now we see the US again trying to make a strategic re-entry into Middle East, trying to sort of accommodate Israel, at the same time trying to temper its responses. So in a way, what has happened in the process is many other powers saw an opportunity to sort of advance their geopolitical interests. The first opportunity was seized by China. We've seen Turkey seize that opportunity in Azerbaijan. And now we see the Iranians and the Middle East actors playing into this vacuum. So one is that. Second, what happens to these middling powers? And as they advance their geopolitical interests and settle old scores, new conflict spots emerge from old conflict lines. And number three, the P5 is divided, 5 nuclear powers. So that is making the UN Security Council very much a redundant body. There is absolutely no consensus on any security issue, which is giving further space to other actors to come and settle scores. And that is where you see Hamas coming in. There have been the installation of Taliban in Afghanistan, and many such areas will open up. So the UNSC is failing. The new middling powers are advancing their own geopolitical interests and settling old scores. And the great power withdrawal, they are being forced to come in, not on their terms. So I leave that thought with you for the discussion to move forward, that how these three factors have created a global churn, and where does this head from here? How does India gain? We can discuss about it, but I just wanted to explain where the global churn is.
That's useful. One of the things you said was that more such points might open up, and we'll come back to that with you. Okay.
So, of course, we are trying to understand the fast-changing world from vantage point of India. What are we trying to achieve, or how do we want to avoid risk in a very uncertain world? So, just taking a cue from where Pranab left, so I'll just go a little back to a very fundamental question. What does nation strategy seek to achieve? Nation strategy, both in terms of its economy, policy, politics, military, it is, end of the day, a country or a nation wants to achieve sustainable development and progress for its population. All other aspects are subsidiary to this large objective of achieving progress. So what is that strategy, development strategy? The post-World War order, United States was the linchpin of that order. There were various development models that different regions and countries evolved, trying to negotiate with the US-led world order. South Asia, so East Asia had a strategy. The Chinese strategy is one strategy, which is actually, while retaining their political identity and its integrity, it actually plugged on to a US capitalist development model and made a hybrid model that now the US sees as a threat. Till 1991, there was some clarity about where the United States is standing, because there was this great division of the world. From 1991 on, the US itself found itself in a state of uncertainty about its own purpose. Why do we exist? That fundamental existential question has actually forced a re-examination within the United States of the business model, the capitalism, technology, how capitalism and democracy negotiates its own terms. How much should labor get? How much should corporations get? What should be a reasonable profit? What is a reasonable wage? All of these things became opened up for renewed debate, just very sharply brought to focus with the Trump revolution. All those questions remain open and under intense debate. So when we talk about national interest, different countries that are coming into conflict, in each of these individual countries, there are various versions of national interest that are coming into conflict. There is no monolith called the U.S. national interest or European interest or not even Israeli interest at this moment. If you look at the divisions that that country itself is trying to negotiate and trying to arrive at a consensus on. So given that overall context, I will very quickly raise 3 points on how India should be trying to process this world and what lessons should we be trying to take on board as discussion point. One, to keep India's strategic autonomy and strategic autonomy in terms of its geopolitical positioning, military strategy, and of course its economic and development strategy, India will have to ensure that its own internal cohesion is an absolutely non-negotiable starting point. A country, if it is actually prone to division, if its country cannot be negotiating on a constant basis, a dynamic manner, what is that country's national interest, that country will be very vulnerable to external manipulation. And in any case, if you do not have unity, what is the strategy that we are going to pursue? That is point number one. Number two, if India has to have a robust development strategy, India will have to be really focusing on its neighborhood. In a hostile neighborhood where India's relationship with its immediate neighborhood is actually defined and understood and articulated in adversarial terms, I think the starting point itself is pretty much of a negative restraining. So India's focus will have to be, while India's relationship with the United States and great power and all that thing will have to be, I'm not saying that you do it at the expense of any of those things, but a refocus on a friendly neighborhood will have to be an imperative. The third point is how much, in a democracy, as I mentioned in the earlier part, my final point, in a democracy, public opinion is extremely important. But the negotiation, though, that how public opinion can be involved in strategy and how public opinion can be used as an instrument of strategy, these are things that we are confronting in the last 2 years. Again, it's a global phenomenon we are also facing. At some point, at some level, you have to have public opinion behind your strategy. But if it is work the other way around, in the sense that you try to make your strategy entirely dependent on public opinion, then you are creating a very difficult situation where more deliberative, wise discussions, and particularly, as all of you who are involved in business negotiations or any negotiations would know, compromise is an essential component of any deal making, any global relationship, whether it is business, military, strategy, or anything. Compromise becomes very difficult. That is a problem that many democracies face, whether it is the United States or Israel, or increasingly, I fear, even India. So, if you are having a strategy, you have to have internal cohesion. You have to have work towards a friendly neighborhood. And three, you will have to really try to reset the role of public opinion in India's national strategy. I'll stop at that. If you have questions, we can do.
Yeah, we'll come back, I guess, to a lot of points that you've raised, but one of them, which, in fact, I'm going to come to you with that, He talked about the neighborhood. You have worked on trade deals from the WTO days. Keep an eye on IPEF. We haven't accepted the trade period. But when it comes to the neighborhood, India's, and South Asia, this is something all of us know. South Asia is one of the least integrated trade-wise regions in the world, if not the least. From that point, in this world, where does India go?
Morning, everybody. One thing which I realized when I sat on this panel was we have 3 current journalists and 3 former journalists sitting on this panel. So it's an interesting group, and it's good to be back with journalists. I mean, that's all that I can say when I begin to talk. And it's a subject which I think which confronts industry quite a bit, but industry does not seriously look at it very closely. And, I think we look at it from little distance, and that's why many times a session like this maybe puts things into perspective. I'll come to your question, Deep, but before that, I just wanted to set some context in terms of how I'm looking at it. I think one of the reasons why geopolitics and somehow economics has not been looked at together is the reason why we are not able to maybe find solutions to some of these problems. Why I say this is, even if you look at India, most of our FTAs have been politically driven, not economically. We started with the Look East policy, and that's when we started negotiating with ASEAN, Japan, and Korea. Nainima understands WTO and trade as much as I do, but I'm sure she would also agree with me that none of these were actually comprehensive or as deep as what it should have. Most of the FTAs India negotiates have been FTAs which seriously don't provide much of a market access to either side. And the best way, I think, to deal with the geopolitics is to come up with solutions that are more economic. Now, we had President Biden recently hinting that it could be that the India, Middle East, Europe corridor is what led to the Hamas attack. It could be one of the reasons why it led to. That means when you see economic prosperity happening, then some political challenges do come up, and then politics can be kind of brought down if you build a strong economic strength among countries. If again, most of the other FTAs that we talked about, we just recently concluded one with Australia, we concluded one with UAE. Again, none of them have teeth. None of them have actual serious market access there. We were negotiating one with EU for the last 8-10 years. We still haven't moved much on that. The India-UK FTA is now floundering because there were some serious discussions on market access. So primarily, the fact is that the way I look at it is most of it is now being politically driven rather than being economically driven. When you talk about the neighborhood, again, Deep, when you look at the SAARC, you look at SAFTA, you look at any of these associations, the reason why it hasn't worked, it does not provide you any economic benefit. These have all been political statements. The WTO has again foundered because the agreements there are binding on people, so nobody wants to go and sign up on an agreement that's binding on you. As long as these are agreements which are not binding on you, these are just general agreements, then people are willing to go and sign up for it. But otherwise, nothing moves forward. So when you're looking at there's a crisis. There's a geopolitical crisis which are coming up across the globe. But I would think that we could solve some of them if we come up with some serious economic solutions, like better, freer trade, providing market access across different countries. And I think that could provide a solution to some of these problems that we have. I don't know if it answers your question, but...
It does. It's a very useful way of thinking. When we say geopolitics and geoeconomics are coming closer, are policymakers also looking at it the same way, right? Or are there compulsions which prevent them from looking at it in that way? We will unpack that a little bit more. But Nainima, if I can come to you for your thoughts.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's wonderful to be on this panel. I will shift the focus more towards military diplomacy. Now, that's what we are seeing the focus is right now, because security and national security has taken center stage. So it's not just about security on your borders, it's also about energy security, climate change, and many other things. You'll see only security coming in. Now, the fact is we live in a very difficult neighborhood, no matter how much we ignore that, or maybe we don't like to address, or we only see it through the fact that, okay, the Chinese are building a dam, so we need to also build a dam. That should not be our approach, right? They're your neighbors. You deal with them the way you've been dealing with them, or have some innovative approach. Now, the fact remains today, when we are seeing two wars happening on two sides of the globe, you really cannot sit and think that, okay, this is happening somewhere far away. And I think that was the initial thought process that happened when the Russia-Ukraine war started. And there is this element of surprise that I see in today's commentary from various experts is that, oh, this has happened. It's surprised that Hamas has attacked. We're surprised that a military coup has taken place in Myanmar, right? So from February, let's say 2021, when the coup started in Myanmar, then the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, August 2021, then the Russia-Ukraine war in February 2022, and now the Israel-Hamas war. How long can we be surprised? It's a fact that we need to face ourselves that tomorrow this can happen also in India. Let us not forget that we are still having a military standoff, that to a very difficult one, since April, March 2020, April, May. And so the thing is, and this is the fourth winter our soldiers will be entering. It's a very difficult terrain, and I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience quite educated enough to understand how difficult it is even for the country's economy. Now, my point is, and I'll keep it short, is the fact that we need to now really have a proper national security strategy. India cannot, and India with its size and population and its economy, cannot really go into the element of surprise, right? We are seeing that wars are back. We cannot say that wars are a thing of past, and we cannot be surprised if we know the history, if we know the root cause. I think after World War II and after that Cold War, there had this, this complacency that had set in. That okay, everything is about economics. Let's keep that like that. It's not like that at all, is what I believe. So I feel now that we're seeing that all this war is happening. We need to have a proper national security doctrine. We need to strengthen the role of CDS more, who's in a way your principal military advisor. You need to strengthen that position of CDS. We need to go for more jointness and theaterization. But then that will all come when you have a larger umbrella of national security doctrine, so that tomorrow, if you also face a situation that's going on in the world, you should not be surprised and you have a proper strategy prepared. Now, let's not say that India has been a country which has never gone in for wars, right? So we've always followed a principle of deterrence. That should be our core fundamental principle. At the same time, I believe that this is the time when we are going for so many joint military exercises with so many countries. Do you really know who your friends are? If you really face a situation like a war, who will really come to your aid? Do you need that aid, or you are self-sufficient? So these are the questions I need to, I want the audience to think about, and how that will impact businesses, economy, all that. These are all interlinked, right? As I said, initially we thought Russia-Ukraine war will not have an impact, but we are seeing that is having an impact. And soon this Israel-Palestine war, or the Israel-Hamas war, whichever way you want to see it, this is also going to impact you. So, and we see how immediately countries start to mobilize their weaponry and other things. Americans are now sending their F-16s. And you also have a neighborhood where both your borders are alive, right? Your entire LSE is live right now. And you have a friendly relationship with Iran, whom your principal friend, which is America, is not having good terms with. You have already your situation with China has gone down. So don't you think that this is the time we need to have a proper national security doctrine? That's my
Absolutely, Naniman. In fact, you talked about Russia and Ukraine. I remember in the early days of the conflict, there used to be these articles that would predict how long this will go on, 3 months till the summer and so on and so forth. And at some point, we saw those articles stop, right? Because clearly there is no easy way of answering these questions. What I'm going to do now is use my privilege as moderator and pull Chetan into the conversation. What has come up in all the comments so far is that this panel agrees that this is a kind of an inflection point, right? Nanima very articulately said it's not all about economics, right? But for companies that are present in multiple markets, when you have internal conversations or when you have them with external stakeholders, do you see this understanding reflect that something fundamentally has shifted?
First of all, I think, it is an economic, geopolitics and geoeconomics cannot be sort of exclusive, right? Cannot be mutually exclusive. And increasingly, as the world economies come closer, I mean, they're all meshed, and that's the fact of life. So I think as large corporations that straddle the worlds, there is a huge responsibility, and it perhaps manifests itself in two or three ways, right? One, culturally, what is the difference that large corporations can bring in terms of just cultural exchange, ensuring there is diversity in your hiring processes, having a wide spectrum of people sort of working in the in these large businesses. I think that becomes very important, and that should be a conscious decision. Two, it's also important that when you go about building your supply chain sort of networks, you are sensitive to the vendors, you're sensitive to the alliances that you are actually forging, right? Because end of the day, if there is a human rights violation with some vendor there, that is a problem. So it has to be based on certain ethical tenets that sort of govern the organization. Three, increasingly with the rise of technology companies, I think they have an extremely important role to ensure a certain amount of diversity of voices, of viewpoints and perspectives, right? And technology companies should continue to provide that forum and ensure free flow of information. And in addition to this, I think companies can also play a role in creating jobs. To the gentleman's point on economic prosperity, being the need of the hour. In many ways, building jobs, ensuring that you contribute and catalyze economic progress in a particular country, in many ways kind of contributes to a certain degree of peace and stability, right? So there's no two ways about that. And the last point is, how do you enable exports? How do you ensure that by virtue of your size, you're able to identify, make in India products in this case, and are able to find markets for these products across the world. So there is also a certain degree of consumerism and a certain appreciation of products that sets in, which clearly brings about a certain degree of, cohesiveness. And again, you have issues like climate change, which perhaps act as unifying factors, right, for companies to rally around. So I guess these would be a few ways for corporations to sort of manage these situations. And also, I think it's very important to address policy eruptions and sort of frictions that occur in a very localized manner. Right? You can't go about taking positions, but it's important that when you're working on behalf of a company, you focus on that segment of issue that you need to sort out and go about, building your advocacy strategy.
I think the word you're looking for is glocal. I have heard it, but is that not?
Glocal sounds good.
Glocal sounds good. Okay, glocal. That's the word for the afternoon, for the morning. But one of the points that Chetan raised, which is what Vish you and I want to come to Varghese you as well, is about supply chain alliances, right? And this is something that we have seen that the world struggling with. Just as there are two internets, there has been talks about how there will possibly be two supply chains in the world, right? Friendshoring is a word that we have all learned in the last year. De-risking, but not decoupling is another phrase that we have heard come up. Wish to you, two major trade alliances, right? RCEP and CPTPP are both deals that both India and the US are out of, right? However, separately, something like an IPF has come up, which, we have heard in conversation is not something similar. Is there any clarity in this environment that we are operating in?
I think India has tremendous clarity, and that's why it is staying away from most of the trade deals. In terms of, you don't want to be, I think, part of any trade deal which it puts a lot of pressure on India in terms of agreeing to open up markets. And that's very clear the way we walked out of RCEP. That's very clear that even in the IPF, we said we don't want to be part of the trade element of it, while we are getting into some of the other areas. But supply chain is something which we are now working on, and we work closely with the Ministry of Commerce, and we realize that that's one area which India will have to be part of. But again, it's not something which is going to be binding. So I think from an Indian perspective, we need to have far more clarity of what kind of trade deals do we really want to be. And if we want to have, same thing with the US. The US again is not, they have now ensured that the WTO does not have an appellate body, which means that all the agreements that we have there, it is not binding on anybody because there's no appellate body to now go and dispute settlement that's happening there. So I think both India and the US are, in a way, do function similarly, if you ask me, in terms of ensuring that most of these trade deals are not something which puts pressure in terms of opening up markets. And both of them have looked at more towards Make in US or Make in India, have been the themes that's been coming.
Vish, if I can quickly follow up on that, in your earlier comment, you talked about how most of our trade deals have been looked at through a political lens and not necessarily an economic lens, right? And the moment you look at it through the economic lens, it requires you, right, to accept certain things which are politically unacceptable. So how does one draw that balance between these two?
I think Ketan mentioned about exports. For us, I think I don't think we look at every time India has gone into any trade deal, we have talked about how large a market. We have never looked at a trade deal to say how large a market the other country is and why do we want to be part of that market. We have always looked at it from the whole way of saying that we have been negotiating this deal because India is a great market. You're going to have a great opportunity, so it's in your interest to negotiate with us rather than for us to go and negotiate with you. And and things have been changing. See, we also have to understand that when you look at the WTO, when you look at most of the trade deals, the WTO functioned perfectly well till the developing countries came together and started challenging some of the issues which came up. The first time in the early 2000s, when all the developing countries got together and started challenging the US and the EU and the others, the US and the EU changed tack. That is the first time when in India in 2002, that time India put this whole grouping of developing countries together. So primarily when you look at the US, again, it has not been very comfortable, I think, being part of any deal where they are not drawing up the agenda. And I think when you're looking at it from an Indian perspective, we are not happy with any deal that puts pressure on opening up areas which are politically sensitive for us. And there are enough areas there which are politically sensitive for us. And that's the reason why most of these economic deals have not happened. And I think that is showing in terms of that we are taking most of our decisions on economics based on the politics that we want to. This is what I think. I'm sure many of you may not agree. And
yeah, so that's a point I think can be discussed a little where, but not the occasion. But I just raise this question: is a nation only its economy? Nation is not its economy. The nation is not its military. Nation is beyond its military. It is beyond its economy. In fact, all the economic decisions a country makes are fundamentally a political decision. Let us say an example that we all are very familiar with: H-1B visas to the United States. By economic logic, no American should be working in any of those jobs. You just open it up, million people, perfect economic logic. But it's just not feasible, and even if it is feasible, it may not be desirable. So various ways we can actually go on illustrating this thing. So therefore, national interest is beyond economic interest, is part of national interest. There is a well-entrenched theory in the United States strategic history about understanding US strategy or US national interest is purely the interest of US corporations. That is one school of this IR theory. It has its own merits and demerits. Again, time to get into it. But if you look at the conflict within the US, I am going back to US again and again because everything else that we discussed is primarily in some way linked to what is happening in the US. Fundamental conflict that is the US is trying to negotiate is various economic actors within the society, what is their share of overall national development? So capital, labor, consumer. These are the three broadly accepted. This Robert Reich has this whole theory. The last 40 years or so, nearly the entire new wealth that was created in the US went to the capital. Who are the ones who are getting squeezed? The labor. Consumers also got a good deal. That is what at least the basic assumption is. Then the consumers, I mean, there is an overlap between these identities. Consumers are also citizens. Consumers are also labor. So when the national interest got the pursuit of national interest got the balance got tilted in favor of one segment of the economy, the whole crisis begins. That is a root of this crisis. So now when you speak about resilience and how to front shore supply chains, two examples again to ponder over. There was this deal between two friends, France and Australia, for a nuclear submarine. That deal did not go to an adversary, went to another friend. So the idea of friend and foe in this kind of an uncertain situation becomes very easy. I'll cite another example. What happened to the Nord Stream pipeline? It made pure, basic, absolute economic sense for Germany to buy gas from Russia, not to import gas from the United States. The pipeline does not exist today. It's not an economic decision, political decision, or a military decision. So these are the things that we are dealing with. So therefore, again, my concern or our concern is, what do we do, India? I think end of the day, we are dealing with an age-old wisdom of appreciating the fact that national interest is also involves developing a national market, national companies, national corporations. Call it protectionism, maybe it is. Is U.S. protectionist? I would say it is. It is one of the most protected economies on the planet. So we have to appreciate the fact that for India's strategic interest, India will have to understand its economy and development as a national entity. It's not isolationism. It is not that, okay, you have enmity with any other country. You reach out, you have to have as many deals, as many avenues as possible for global corporate cooperation and advance your interest. But to get into an ideological commitment to a global economy, because there is something intrinsically, philosophically good about it, is not borne by historical evidence, or as we speak, as I said, friends and enemies and frenemies can't really figure out.
If I could very quickly. Just a couple of weeks back, I think Ajay circulated a very interesting article from The Economist, the latest issue, which talks about, they call protectionism as homeland economics. That's the new term that The Economist has coined, where, it has brought out studies after study, and which clearly shows that any country that builds out a plan that really focuses on growing its domestic players and sector in the long run stands to sort of fail, right? And which is interesting, just for the sake of sort of academic interest, maybe it would be useful to just take a look at that.
Okay, Pranab, I'll come to you to help us make sense of what we have. We have opened the ball of yarn, and there's a lot of strings that are lying around. Help us bring all of it together, including what Chetan said, that are then countries turning protectionist, at least in the medium term? Is that what this new world order, new world situation leading us towards?
Firstly, I know there's a whole gloomy picture out there, but frankly, from an Indian perspective, a churn may not be a bad thing. I, for one, believe that if India plays it correctly, India may be a net gainer from this churn. That's point number one. Churns have happened in history. Point number two is this government's approach, and this has to be really thought through carefully. How has India approached its response to the Chinese military aggression? One was to obviously stand out there and defend yourself, but the response has been all economic. Think about it. Starting with digital and particularly next generation sectors. Uh, so the new responses, our security responses, are going to be economic in nature, and that's something business has to understand. Uh, Even in bigger countries, business has gone with security logic of the country. Third, I think on the point about FTAs, I think the whole idea is how can we use trade deals? At least this government's bet is become a manufacturing economy again, as countries look to de-risk or companies look to de-risk from China. So while the East did not work, there is definitely a look West which is happening. You look at the trade negotiations, even Australia, one example, but you look at one with UK or you look at the one with EU. Only thing is, again, political decisions will be called for on issues such as climate change, dispute resolution, things like that. That will require Indian governance systems to jump up a few notches. Can the government do that? And number four, how much ever we say that we can go protectionist, the fact is, what is the main objective today in whatever countries are talking in the current crisis in the Middle East? The Straits of Hormuz should not close. Right? That's the whole point about the ground invasion. Those chains will remain, right? There is a red line which economics draws. This is exactly why China is different from Soviet Union. You can have an adversarial situation. We talked about decoupling, and now people are talking about de-risking. Because any supply chain, you remove the first layer, second layer, third layer, there is China. So there is a practical point about it. So this is a very globalized economy. It cannot overnight deglobalize itself. That will have consequences domestically. You know, what happens to even Indian economy if those supply chains don't come? So you see, one is to find alternate supply chains. The second is to build them. We've got Quad, we've got all these countries talking about supply. Look at chips. We've got this great, the Micron has invested in it, but chips won't happen overnight. So there's a huge distance to be traveled. So one is, how do you stay away from any security situation on yourself? Don't enter into a conflict. How do you leverage the economic opportunities correctly for yourself? Remember, China leveraged them really well when the Cold War ended and got into WTO. And despite not meeting many of the political standards, and the Americans helped them get it. So how do you leverage this? I think what India should desist from is its old style principal diplomacy, where we did everything correct, but were out of every other arrangement just because we did not take sides. So we have to be nimble with it. We need to take decisions on the go and make sure that we emerge as the net gainer by playing this well. Churn may not be a bad thing. In fact, something new will come up and we could emerge as net gainers, and that is the challenge. And most of the leveraging will have to be done by the economic players, essentially business.
So I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience. The gentleman right in the middle.
So my question is, when we talk about emerging global challenges, there is increasing possibility of interstate conflicts over scarcity of natural resources, particularly water, because we are already looking at increasing bone of contention among the two African states, Egypt and Ethiopia, over the Grand Renaissance Dam. How do you look at this issue, and most importantly, what do you think India can do to not to see itself in the same situation?
Did you mention who your question is directed to?
I mean,
Okay, so if there are any other questions, let's take one or two questions and then answer them together, if that's possible.
And my question is directed towards a technopolar world. Like we say, it's a bipolar and a multipolar world. But during the Russia-Ukraine war, we saw that Starlink was very critical to Ukraine's defense, but then it was temporarily restricted. So how do we address such an issue where a global corporate actor is not necessarily aligned with your own home country all the time? So how do we address this, especially because they're not party to any treaty at all, any international treaties?
Anyone else? Going once, going twice? Yes.
So recently there was a meme that was going around about this airspace, which basically was a security one, and you had all the other airlines bunched up at this, but Indian Airlines was going straight. Where it was funny at first, talking about India's grid in geopolitics, whether it's about procuring crude oil from different parts, or banning repeat exports to protect national interests. Now that India is emerging as a bigger power in the New World Order, do you think this will actually hamper our agility or embolden us further?
Okay, got it. Okay, so what I'll do is, Pranav, I'll start with you. Answer any or as many of the questions you want, then I'll Varghese come to you, and then we'll finally to you.
Gentleman asked about water. I think it's a very important thing. And when I was making my initial remarks, I talked about countries trying to settle their old scores. So I think Egypt and Ethiopia are a good example over there. When you're talking basically about damming the Nile and stuff like that. But from an Indian context, you look at what's happening to the Indus Waters Treaty, right? It's out there. It's in dispute. I don't think, and there is fear that India can weaponize water from its side, and we have similar fears with China. So essentially, upstream versus nations versus downstream nation. That's going to be one line of conflict which we can see when it comes to water, and so always the upstream nation will have the privilege of weaponizing depending on their ability to do so. On the tech point, ma'am, I think if there is one area where there is clarity, in my view, it is where the world will be divided into two, is technology. We are headed to two clear systems, the American-led tech system and the Chinese-led tech system. It's just going to be as bipolar as that. You'll have to choose which system you're going to be part of. I think India has already made that choice, given its you just saw there was something called the ISET, which we signed with the Americans. I think that itself lays it down which side of tech divide, as they are saying, we're going to be. As far as that, your agility part is concerned, I think, okay, so here's the thing. I mean, the Sarkari line is we have a lot of goodwill, but really largely because we have been a benign power. And so that's really been working. We have tried to work with the Russians and with the Americans and with this thing. I mean, look, the Americans come and tell us, you want to buy our equipment and you're also ordering Russian S-400s, and we are able to convince them कि नहीं यार कर लेते हैं. What hodgepodge we'll make of it, that's a separate issue. So I think that degree, but on a serious note, if you look at it, and it's saying a bit too much, no one wants to see India fail. It's a bad thing for the world. It's a bad thing for democracies. It's a bad thing even for those who are trying to balance out China. So people want to hold leverage against China. Even the Russians would want to have some leverage against China. So a lot of people don't want India to fail. So that's why the bet on India is there, and wherever you can get it, that's where the opportunity, and that's why I say we can emerge as a net gainer.
Taking no sides, though I am personally very ferociously taking sides in this debate, India's strategy of not taking sides actually has worked well for India. I think that is, I hope it will work in future as well. On the question of technology, very two quick points. One is that these technology companies that had defied the national boundaries and national sovereignty, American government is trying to force them to fall in line and subject themselves to American sovereignty. That is one conflict that is being negotiated within the US. Then this determinism that we associate with the technological progress, that also will have to be examined, particularly in the context of what is happening in the Middle East war, where technologically far superior country was taken by surprise by some rudimentary technology that some people just surface from underneath the earth. So these are the 2 points of technology. Again, topics.
I feel personally attacked when you talk about driving on the middle of the road and not taking lanes. But I think one of the things that Pranav was saying has been expertly said in a movie, a Spider-Man movie, which says with great power comes great responsibility. It may not be as easy to not take sides. And my last words from you.
Well, I guess that question on technology was very interesting, but then what we are seeing, and as I had mentioned earlier also, we cannot ignore human intelligence. That's where the man-to-man thing works, which is why, if you see, we know very well Israel is much more technologically advanced than Hamas, but then even then they just use the bulldozer and cut the border through those wires. So Nobody knew about the planning that was going on. Did you know what the Taliban was planning? I was there in Afghanistan when the takeover happened, so I saw how easy it was for the world media to say, oh, the Taliban will come one day as if they'll get crashed into some party. They were very much there. That human intelligence, the man-to-man intelligence will always be there, the conventional way of strategizing things. And that is where I think India also specializes in and needs to enhance. Uh, Coming to the water issue, yes, I think that will be the biggest dividing topic, which was there. The Israel-Palestine issue started way back on water, and that will continue even, when all countries are concerned. You see at India, Bangladesh as well. The Teesta Water Treaty is the most contentious issue that you have, despite all the bonhomie between both the countries currently. Coming to the Air India thing, well, I've been a victim myself. When the takeover happened, Air India refused to come into Kabul. There were various factors for that. And then we had the Americans, mobilizing a Globemaster, a C-17 came in, and that's how it came back. But then the fact is, yes, strategic autonomy is something that you require, and that is something India has played well. I do hope that we continue to play that well, but then, again, as I said, the non-alignment days are gone, although, there's a new fancy name called strategic autonomy, which is similar as non-alignment. But then you are increasingly tilting towards one side. If you do that, you need to also understand how you balance it out. We've been doing the balancing act very well. But then again, to build resilience, you need to have a proper strategy. You just can't have ad hoc measures addressing concerns when they come right at you. You didn't know how to deal with China. Now you are stuck in that game, right? Had you had a doctrine or a security strategy, maybe you have had done something. And now China is completely against you. You need to understand how you will do the business. So as I said, and as Pranav said, we don't know what hodgepodge we are creating. I just hope that we continue the balancing act well going forward.
I hope we continue the balancing act. Thank you so much, Nayanima, Varghese, and Pranav, and Vish, for your thoughts.